So hi, as she said, my name is Brandy Horne. I'm an instruction and reference librarian at the Greg Graniteville Library at the University of South Carolina, Aiken. We're on the border with Georgia, right across the river from Augusta, Georgia, which is where they do the Masters golf tournament, just to give you a geographic idea of where I'm at. And this presentation is a variation on a presentation that I developed several years ago, talking about fake news, and I developed this kind of at the beginning of the whole fake news swell, basically, of that concept. So fake news is not the problem, issues with information consumption in a digital environment. So I argue, let's see, did that slide change on your end? No, there we go. Okay, I argue that fake news is a problem, but it is not the problem. We are a society that values free speech, and so we are reluctant, and rightly so, to censor speech, no matter how ridiculous. One of the ways librarians have tried to address the prevalence of fake news is to teach people how to evaluate information for themselves, to arm them with the knowledge and skills necessary to make more informed decisions. That's kind of our goal as information professionals. Except that what we're currently dealing with as a nation and as a global community isn't just going to be solved by showing people these are the steps you take to evaluate information, right? Like different tests that we use in academia, like the CRAP test, or the PATS test, like, how to identify like authority and timeliness and scope of information. These are very academic pursuits, right? So for everyday kind of information consumption, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Fake news is an issue, but it's part of a larger whole, or perhaps a symptom of a more fundamental problem, which I think, my theory is that we're dealing with something that's kind of a quirk in the human brain. The real problem is one of human nature, and the only way to deal with it is to reprogram ourselves, reprogram our brains, to condition ourselves to seek and to value truth and understanding over comfort and validation, okay? So teaching people to evaluate information and giving them the tools and saying, this is how you do that, is often a fruitless task, because people have to want to evaluate information, right? They have to want to question it, they have to want to feel uncomfortable, and they have to want to reevaluate themselves. And if they're not interested in doing that, then they're not interested, then they're not going to evaluate the information. They're going to continue to consume what's comfortable to them, okay? I intend this presentation to be sort of a conversation starter. And so hopefully we'll have a decent amount of time at the end for you to ask questions and for us to kind of talk about things. Because mostly my purpose in this, my goal is to raise awareness and have people be thoughtful about the different things that we're going to talk about, and how these things might play a role in their own lives. And so I'm interested in knowing how people react to this. So like I said, the intention behind this is to be sort of a conversation starter. And as I said, to raise awareness. So we're going to go through several factors. We're going to look at psychological factors dealing with how people consume information online, and then we're going to look at technological factors, and we're going to see how these things play off of each other. Okay, so psychological factors. It's very possible or very likely that a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today are things that you've heard of before, but hopefully pulling it all together into some sort of cohesive whole will help you to be able to think about it in a different way. And like I said, raise awareness as to what might be going on behind the scenes of your information consumption. So starting off with the psychological factors, we have this concept of cognitive dissonance, which again, I'm sure that you've heard at some point. Cognitive dissonance is the stress a person feels when confronted with new information that contradicts what they think they already know, their beliefs, their ideas, their values, okay? So you hold something very dear, or a strongly held belief or idea, Anytime you encounter something that contradicts that or challenges that, it creates a sense of, it makes you uncomfortable, right? You're seeing information that doesn't line up, that creates that sense of dissonance. So that's where we get this idea of cognitive dissonance. It's not a comfortable state. It's not something that we want to experience. And so there are different ways that people address this. Kind of a couple of different avenues. A healthy way to address it is to take the new information and examine your beliefs or your ideas or whatever it is that it's challenging, and reevaluate based on the new information, right? That's a healthy way to do it. You take the new information into consideration, you weigh things against each other, and then you make a determination. You say, okay, this information is not enough for me to let go of this, or it's not credible, or some reason, or it is. It's like, this is compelling information. I need to reevaluate and adjust my stance. And that's healthy, right? I know a lot of times we think of people as being like wishy-washy when they change their opinions of things. No, that's healthy behavior. My opinions on things have changed drastically over the last 20, 30 years. I was 10, 30 or 12, 30 years ago, but over the last 20 or 25 years, my opinions have changed a lot. And that's just a natural part of growth and development. So people need to kind of be okay with that. And another way that people address or deal with cognitive dissonance is just by avoiding the new information altogether. So they either ignore it or they just choose not to believe it, okay? And that's because they want to avoid that discomfort, and they're not interested in letting go of these ideas that they have. So one way to deal with cognitive dissonance is you address it and you reevaluate based on the new information, or you avoid it and just go about your merry way, okay? So people who choose to avoid it often engage in these, in what we call selective exposure, where they choose to consume specific pieces of information, and then they specifically choose to avoid certain types of information or certain pieces of information. There's also this concept of confirmation bias. Selective exposure is more of an active thing, whereas confirmation bias can be completely passive. It can be something that happens and you don't even realize it. An example I use, a couple of years ago, I bought a new vehicle. I bought a black Kia Sorento. And as soon as I bought my black Kia Sorento, I started seeing black Kia Sorentos everywhere, all through town. And I was like, I had never noticed it before, but now I feel like half of Aiken, South Carolina drives a black Kia Sorento. Because now it's something that I connect with and I see, and I feel like I've identified a pattern that wasn't there before. Or maybe I see over the course of a day, 3 people wear green t-shirts, and then at the end of the day, I'm like, everyone was wearing green today. Even though chances are I saw 400 people and only 3 were wearing green, in my mind, at the end of the day, everyone was wearing green, okay? So you pick up on a detail, and then you continue to see, like, you just kind of pull that out of all the data that's going on around you, and you focus on that one detail. So that is kind of confirmation bias at play. Whether or not it's true, you've identified some sort of pattern that seems to be meaningful to you. So selective exposure, as I said, is more of an active thing where you're choosing to consume pieces of information, you're choosing not to consume pieces of information. And then confirmation bias is more passive in that you're seeing and remembering only evidence that supports whatever pattern or idea that you have. And you're kind of ignoring or overlooking everything else that contradicts it, okay? So for people that are avoiding cognitive dissonance, these are kind of activities or habits of the mind that people engage in, whether they realize it or not. This is not anything new. I see this in my students all the time. Because one of the things I do, I'm an instruction and reference librarian. So in the instruction portion of my job, I teach students how to engage in the research process appropriately. And in the reference portion of my job, I help students one-on-one with their research. So instruction is normally in classrooms and reference is normally one-on-one. And I find when I'm helping students one-on-one in reference or research assistance, if they have trouble with the research process, they're usually running into one or both of these two problems. They don't know what search terms to type into the box to get the information that they need. And we'll actually address that in a little bit to some extent. And also they approach the research process backwards. And what I mean by that is represented by this triangle on the screen. What they do is they start research with a thesis in mind. And then like something like this causes this, or this is what's going on here, or this is how these things are related. And then they look for information to support that thesis, okay? The problem with that though, is that if their thesis is flawed, or if it's just wrong, and especially if they're limited to just library resources, because we're careful about what we collect to include in the library's collections, right? We generally go only for high quality information. If they're limited to library resources and they have a flawed thesis or one that's completely wrong, they're not going to find information to support it. And so they end up engaging in the research process and just getting frustrated because as far as they can tell, the library doesn't have anything, or the library doesn't have what they need, right? The problem with this is though, is that the purpose of research is for us to answer a question, for us to learn more new information, for us to get a better understanding of something. And so when you start or when you begin the research process, it should look more like an upside down triangle, okay? You should have a topic in mind, something that you want to learn more about. And then you read broadly about it. You figure out what's going on, the different aspects of the topic. You explore and see what it encompasses. And then as you are engaging in this exploration phase, you'll see that there are things that are more interesting to you than other things. And you'll start to make connections or ask questions. Well, how does this impact this? Why is this the case over here? How are these things related? And then you decide on a question that you genuinely want to answer. Once you've decided on your question, then you start looking for information to help you answer that question. The answer you find then becomes your thesis, right? So by the time you have a thesis in mind, you should have already done the bulk of your research, because the thesis is the result of research, okay? I think students confuse the concept of a hypothesis, which is your best guess, and that's fine. You can go into research thinking, I think that this is what's going on. But if you find information that contradicts that, you reevaluate your hypothesis, right? When we talked about that earlier, that cognitive dissonance, you can take in the new information and reevaluate. That's what the scientific process is. You have a best guess, you have an idea, you encounter new information, then you reevaluate, okay? That's how the research process should go. So this is what we run into with students. They're very much into confirmation bias and selective exposure. That's the mindset they come into research with when they're in college, when they get to college. And a lot of what I do is showing them how to engage in this process in the appropriate way, okay? So again, the driving factor, the driving motivation here should be to learn, to understand, and to answer a question. Should not be necessarily just validation, okay? Possibly, if anyone in this group has gotten into an internet argument, which I spent the better part of like maybe 5 years in internet arguments all the time, but you've encountered this phenomenon of the backfire effect. And what we have when we talk about the backfire effect, what we have is a situation where a person's beliefs are challenged, and then rather than evaluating them in the context of the new information, they tend to dig in and their beliefs become more entrenched. And this comes from a study, this concept comes from a study from Nye and Reifler in around 2009, where what they found was they had people answer questionnaires so that they could determine where they fell on the ideological spectrum, and then gave them an article to read that provided information that would be something that that would reinforce like their beliefs or ideas along that spectrum. And then they were given a questionnaire like, how strongly do you feel about this? How strongly do you feel about this? And then after that was done, they issued another copy of the same article, but with some information corrected, saying, oh, some of the information in the previous article was wrong. This is the correct information. And with the corrected information, and then contradicted their ideas and values according to where they fell on the spectrum, right? And then they're issued another questionnaire. How strongly do you feel about this? How strongly do you feel about this? And they found that they felt even more strongly and more certain in their original idea than they did with the first article. So when confronted with information that would cause them to reevaluate, instead of doing that and feeling less strongly about the idea, they felt more strongly about it. And that's what Nyan and Reifler had decided to label the backfire effect. Presenting facts and new information to people doesn't necessarily have the effect or impact that we would like it to, okay? And again, if you've ever gotten into an internet argument, you've seen this in play. Is this new? No. So this picture of the World Book, these are not my copies, but I found this online. When I was a very small child, my parents bought the World Book Encyclopedia. So those would have been like the early 80s. My parents bought, the World Book Encyclopedia and like a giant atlas because I come from a very argumentative people, and we fuss and argue about everything. And again, this was in the early 80s. They needed some sort of authority to refer to as the referee in these arguments. Otherwise, they would just go on forever, right? So they bought an encyclopedia. So this was not for my educational well-being or anything like that. This was specifically for, my maiden name is Bell, for the Bell family to be able to settle arguments. And the last instance I can remember my parents referring to whatever is the atlas. Several years ago, some friends of mine, we were staying with his parents in North Georgia, and then we crossed over the border to a craft fair in North Carolina. And at no point in my life before that did I know that Georgia and North Carolina shared a border. I didn't think that they touched. And so like I was talking to my mom later and I told her about it. She's like, no, they don't touch. I was like, they do, because I crossed that border. And she didn't believe me. And I could hear her on the phone go and haul out the giant atlas and flip through the pages and then look. And in the background, like my dad's talking, my dad's retired Marine Corps. So you can imagine the colorful language that he was using to say that I didn't know what I was talking about. But you could hear my mom flipping through the atlas, and then there was silence. And then she was like, Raymond, which is my dad's name. She's like, Raymond, they touch. And it was so dramatic. It was such a dramatic moment. And then you could like hear the silence as they looked at the atlas. And then the only acknowledgement I got from my dad was, and that was it. But that's the only time I could think of that my dad has ever like acknowledged that I was right and he was wrong. But it was because of that atlas and not anything else, and not the fact that I experienced it and drove over the border myself. So people need that kind of, we rely on those kinds of authoritative texts, those sources of authority to, ultimately tell us, yes, this is what it is, okay? However, that's not as common or really as possible as it used to be. Back in the 80s, when you had a encyclopedia set, that's what you had, right? So back in the day, when we look at media in general, we had few major news networks, right? ABC, NBC, CBS, whatever, just had a handful. And of course, everything is driven by money, right? They're all competing for the same advertising dollars. And so in order to draw in as much of that as possible, they had to produce or provide as much of an audience as possible to the advertisers, right? And in order to do that, you just have a handful of news networks competing for the same advertising dollars and the same audience, essentially. So that was motivation for them to be as centrist as possible so that they could pull in as many people as possible, okay? And by doing that, in a sense, they were covering information in the same way, presenting it in basically the same way, and therefore created a sort of shared reality that everyone was operating within. Okay, they're getting the same basic information, packaged in basically the same way. And at that point, it was just a matter of which news anchor do you feel more comfortable with or whatever. You know, there's certain things that people used to make to decide what to follow, but essentially the information was the same. And then you have the internet. And I wish I knew who to attribute this quote to. I don't know. But the best thing about the internet is that anyone can publish. It's an ultimately democratizing force. Everyone has a voice with the internet. And the worst thing about the internet is that anyone can publish. And it gives literally everyone a voice, no matter what their ideas are, okay? So we have the internet, and therefore we see the beginning of the fracturing of information. So with the internet, you have practically infinite amounts of information, right? And it's constantly, content is being produced. There's no end to it. People are forced to make choices as to what they consume because it's impossible to consume it all. There's just so much. And people, when given a choice, are generally going to decide to consume the information that is most comfortable to them, okay? They're not gonna intentionally put themselves in a position of being challenged and uncomfortable all the time. So also with the internet, the same as we had with the very few news networks before, you still have a situation where these entities, these information entities, are driven by money, right? Because everything needs money to run. And they're competing for advertisers. But because the internet is so vast and people can choose whatever they want, right? And they tend to choose what's most comfortable to them, there's no incentive to be centrist, okay? There's not so much incentive for that. There's more incentive for carving out a very niche audience and then being able to pull in advertising dollars from very specific entities, right? So, you know, if you have a more like liberal site and you want to sell certain things or whatever, then you could target that audience. Or if you're a more conservative kind of leaning site, you can target that audience. You're not really selling, you know, deer stands to vegetarians, right? So being able to like understand and define a very specific audience can make you appealing to certain advertisers or sellers, okay? So there's not so much there's not so much the motivation or incentive to be as centrist as possible. It's more to carve out very specific audiences and appeal to them so that you can sell that kind of advertising, okay? And they do this by appealing to people's like their vanity, their intelligence, like, oh, you're here because, you know, you're too smart for mainstream media, blah, 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 like that kind of language that you see. And specific language, conservatives tend to respond to certain language better, and then liberals tend to respond to certain language better. And there are things that you may not even be aware of as you're going through and you're reading things or looking at a results list, but we tend to have these, they tend to be things that we respond to. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but just pay attention to the kind of language that you find appealing and the kind of language that turns you off. And you'll kind of see what's going on there. So those are psychological factors, okay? That's the kind of stuff that's going on. That's the human nature aspect of that. So let's look now at some technological factors. Technology that's been kind of created with an awareness of human nature, and that kind of builds off of that. So several years ago, I saw a TED Talk by Eli Pariser about the filter bubble. And what this concept is when you are engaging with information online and you're conducting searches with Google or whatever, there are algorithms running in the background that follow many different factors about your search habits and looking at your search history and the kinds of things you click on and that kind of stuff. And what these algorithms are trying to do is they're trying to deliver information that you will click on. It's trying to give you a results page that has a higher likelihood of you clicking on something. Because as we said, money is what drives everything. Clicks are what drive advertising dollars, right? And they want you to click on things. So whenever you do a search online, let's say you're using Google, your results page is not necessarily going to be the same as a friend's results page. I think people tend to think that these are objective results lists, and they're not. They're very subjective based on all of this information that the search engine has about you, okay? So that's the concept of the filter bubble. He found that he would, Eli Pariser found that like when he did a search on a specific country, he was getting information about politics and conflict and stuff. But then he had a friend of his do the same search and he was getting information on like travel and all this kind of stuff. They had completely different results pages searching the exact same terms, okay? So you have this filter bubble, this set of algorithms that filters the information that makes it to you. And in a sense, kind of creates a specific experience online, a specific reality that could be very, very different from someone else's. So you have this concept of the filter bubble, these different algorithms that impact the information you get when you search. Search language is also important. Remember I mentioned before that students have trouble knowing what language to type into search boxes to get the information they need. Search language is extremely important. In the context of the academic library, it's important in the fact that, you know, the information is collected and organized according to subject terms. And so it's important to have the right language, the right academic language to access the information you need. When you're searching online with Google, language is important, but for some different reasons. First of all, people assume that Google answers questions or that search engines answer questions. And so they type in full questions. And I have been guilty of this. I've typed in, why does my dog vomit after eating grass, right? Because it's just like, we know that that's, you know, we know that that's gonna work, basically, you know, typing that in, that somehow it's gonna give me some information, right? But what Google is doing, it's not looking at your question and saying, oh, they need an answer to this question. It's looking at the language that you've used in your question and is trying to find documents that contain that same language, and it's going to return those documents to you, okay? This is important because language, if you're not very careful and you're not thoughtful about it, the language that you use can like drastically dictate or impact the type of information you access online. So let's say you follow a bunch of news sources or a bunch of sources that all argue that global warming is a hoax, right? And so all of the information you've seen have kind of contextualized it in that way and with that language. So if you do a search, maybe you're thinking, I would like to actually know, maybe you're trying to do your due diligence, right? And then you go to Google and you type in, is global warming a hoax? This is what happens with that. Google doesn't see a question. Google sees global warming, this concept, and hoax. And so what you're going to get in your results list, especially if you're already consuming a bunch of information sources that perpetuate this idea, you're going to get more of the same. You're going to get more documents that say global warming is a hoax that contain those words. And you're going to feel like, oh, okay, this is the case because everything is coming back that way. If you were to search, is global warming real? You have the same issue. Global warming is one concept and real is another concept. So you're going to get documents that contain those words, right? So your search language, if you're not careful, language carries inherent bias, right? And certain things, if they're trying to present information in a particular way with a particular perspective, will rely on information that conveys that will rely on language that conveys that perspective. So if you're using that language, that specific language, you're going to get more of the same. And that's what we get into when we talk about the echo chamber. What you put out is what you get back, right? What you type into the search engine is what you're going to get back in your results list. Okay, so search language is really important when it comes to the type of information that you access online. So this is a graphic I came up with several years ago because I think this is important. I think this is something that people need to pay attention to, especially in the context of like that search language and everything. At least early on, right, when you first get on the internet and you're swimming around, or when the internet first kind of started to have its rise, you had to actively look for information, right? You had to go on and you had to search, and then you had to, you know, like click on different things. But over time, right? Over time, you decide, I like this publication, and maybe you follow it. Like you follow their RSS feed. Maybe you like them on Twitter or Facebook, right? And then you find this publication, and you find this website and this website. And then over time, you decide that, you know, these 7 or 10 places are the places that I really like, and I follow them. And there comes a point where you're no longer necessarily actively looking for information. You're kind of passively receiving it because you're getting updates from them on Facebook, on Twitter, okay? So you're not necessarily going out and actively seeking information, you're letting it come to you, right? Which is convenient, right? Every day you can scroll through your feed and you get all this information, and it's super easy. But the issue is that we tend to gravitate towards information sources that are comfortable to us, right? And that generally means that they are presenting a certain perspective, so that all new information, all news, essentially, current events and everything, is being filtered to you through these publications. And so by the time you get this new information, it's already been neatly packaged and handed to you with very specific language and a very specific perspective. So your first introduction to new information, to issues or anything going on, has an embedded bias and perspective to it. And we tend to hold on to our first introduction to something, right? When I was a kid, if my brother and I got into a fight, I was the first one to go to my parents and give my side of the story. Because inherently I knew that if I were to give my side first, I would have more sway, right? So there's that idea that first there has the better footing, okay? So we need to be aware of the kinds of information sources that we decide to follow, because if we find that they're very homogenous, we could be getting or perpetuating a very skewed sense of the way things are, just by virtue of the fact that we're getting information from very specific types of sources, okay? Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So we have this graphic: active seeking, going out looking for information, but then passive consumption, where it's just being fed and filtered to you. Social media is how we do a lot of this: Facebook, Twitter. More and more people are getting their news from these outlets or from these platforms, with the added benefit, I suppose, of people liking to share stories, right? So people share stories that they find online, and they tend to share things, first of all, that make them laugh, right? Or anything that they think is, you know, hilarious or amazing. But they also tend to share things that validate their beliefs, right? And so you come across a story and you're like, yes. And then you click share, and then you're like, this. And then all of your friends are like, you know? So you have a specific idea. You found a story that validates it, you share it, and then your friends who have that same idea continue to validate you further by saying, you know, yes, this is how I feel too, right? So there's a cycle of validation there that comes into play when you're interacting with information on a social media platform. And it motivates us to share things in that context, right? Because we get that reward of that feeling of validation. What I think is important is that because we're getting information in these ways, that people have kind of lost track of what different types of information are, because it's not always obvious, because what we're doing is separating them from the publications themselves. When you're looking at a newspaper, you know what items are news, you know what's editorial or op-eds in general, you know what's analysis, you know what's sports and entertainment and blah, blah, because it's labeled, right? And it's organized in a way that we all kind of understand. So when you look at information or news in print, it's kind of easy to figure out what's what. But when you're online and it's pulled away from the original publication and you don't see the overall organization, it can be confusing to know what we're looking at, right? And the reason I point this out is I've read things before, and this happens a lot, where you're reading something online and then maybe it's something that presents a very specific perspective, And then you have in the comments like rants and raves about this is the downfall of journalism. News is supposed to present information. There's no room for opinion, blah, 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 blah. But the thing is, like, that thing was an op-ed, or that thing was a blog post, or that thing was not news, right? Not what we think of as news, like the objective factual information, right? And so because people are not necessarily recognizing or making the distinctions between types of information online, they're just declaring it all garbage. And that's not fair, right? Because you have news, you have the straight factual information, but how many of us really understand, you know, the United States has altered its trade policy to Cuba and have done this. How many of us understand the actual impact of that thing? Probably not anyone, unless they are economists or they purchase something that comes from somewhere, right? Most people are not going to understand a thing. That's where you get op-eds and analysis and things like that, where people are looking at it and saying, this is how this could impact this. This is good because of this. This is bad because of this. So these kinds of things have a role in the information landscape, because they take this information that we may not have any way to contextualize or understand, and then provide us with that context, and then provide us with language to be able to articulate maybe our thoughts on that, right? So there is room for that. There is room for things that are inherently biased, because they help us kind of figure out where we fall, right? And so to see things that have specific arguments or try to perpetuate a viewpoint, that's not inherently bad information. It's a specific viewpoint. The problem is when you're consuming all of the same viewpoint over and over and over again, that's when you run into problems. We need to kind of branch out from that. So types of information, news, op-eds, tabloids, right? We need to know what's gossip and what's not. Parody, things that are there for entertainment purposes. Propaganda, right? Government propaganda. We need to kind of be aware of that kind of thing. Blogs are on the rise, and sometimes blogs are hard to tell from actual news sources. Advertising, misinformation, disinformation. We need to know the difference between news and opinions and op-eds, and then actual like obfuscation, people trying to put out bad information in order to create like a negative impact, right? We just need to be aware that there are different types of information and understand their role in the information landscape. And just kind of acknowledge that in print, it's easy to identify, online, not so much, and often it's intentionally obscured. So how do we choose what to consume? There's this whole kind of framework that Paroli and Card came up with, this concept of information foraging, that's based on the hunter-gatherer structure, that implies that information seeking is behavioral and instinctual. And like I said, we tend to gravitate towards things that make us feel more comfortable. Information scent is one of these concepts that fall under the information foraging. Refers to the textual clues of an item as it appears in a results list, and how a person perceives its usefulness based on these clues. So they look at language, the type of words that are there, maybe images that come up in the results list, and they tend to click on things that feel comfortable or feel like, okay, this is what I'm looking for. So they're picking up on that information scent. And this concept of the information diet is the information that you consume on a daily basis. And we always talk about diet in like the real form when you're talking about food. You should eat a variety of things. The same applies to information. You should consume a variety of things. So when we talked about the psychological and the technological factors, you have the psychological, the human nature, which is cognitive dissonance, which is that sense of discomfort. And then when we try to avoid that, we engage in selective exposure, and then confirmation bias is a part of that. And then you have this concept of the backfire effect, right? So you have these psychological factors, and then you have technological factors, filter bubbles, which are trying to create a nice environment for you. Search language, right, which dictates strongly the kind of information that you receive, but it's also dictated by the kind of information that you've already consumed. Social media, which gives us that that validation when we share things, and then all the information that we subscribe to essentially is filtered through to us. And then this concept of information foraging. And you can see how the technological factors build on and reinforce the psychological factors and create this self-reinforcing cycle, right? We see how these things build off each other. So it's up to us to be conscious and aware of these things so that we can make changes in our behavior in order to address this. The results of this, no shared reality, right? Everyone is creating their own individual little realities, their own individual little worlds. We have extreme polarization, right? Because you have a situation where I'm getting all this information, someone over here is getting all this information. It could be on vastly different ends of the spectrum, right? And we feel like everyone agrees with us because all the information that we come across seems to align with our beliefs and our ideas. And that creates a breakdown in civil discourse, because not only do we have vastly different experiences online, it's also contributing to vastly different vocabularies. You have people arguing Second Amendment rights over here. You have people arguing gun control over here. It's the same topic, very different languages from different perspectives, right? So no shared reality, extreme polarization, and therefore breakdown of civil discourse. So why does this matter? So just a couple of examples of language and how you can treat the same topic with very different language. This has been several years ago. But one of those legislation that comes out of like bakers and wedding cakes and things like that, Washington Post reports the outcome of this one case. Arizona governor vetoes, or not case, but Arizona governor vetoes controversial anti-gay bill. And then Wall Street Journal, Arizona governor vetoes religious freedom bill. Same bill, two vastly different takes on what that means, right? Both major publications, but very different approaches to what's going on. So if you consume one and not the other, chances are you have that perspective, or you buy into that particular perspective. Another issue or another example of language, at the top you have during Katrina, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting, and I've got that circled, a grocery store in New Orleans. And under that, we have same situation, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. Same situation, same kind of context, but the language there is extremely important, right? One is characterizing this activity as looting. The other one is basically characterizing it as survival, right? And that's important, right? And then there's also the visual cues of the white people versus the non-white, right? So there's that issue. Excuse me. So language in describing something is important. Excuse me, sorry. The problem with the phrase fake news, technically The Onion, if you've ever read The Onion, and the Borowitz Report are fake news. These are satire sites. They're created for the purposes of entertainment and humor. Technically, these are fake news. So the actual term fake news is imprecise and meaningless. We find that it's been kind of weaponized by people to discredit information that they find unfavorable to whatever their ideas are, or that make them uncomfortable. And so for them, for people, often just declaring something as fake news tends to be that catch-all shield for them, and then they move on. And there's really no discussion past that point. So used by people to discredit unfavorable or uncomfortable news coverage or information. So this concept of fake news is a meaningless catch-all term. If we come across something that we feel like is bad information, we need to identify what it is. Is it propaganda? Is it misinformation? Is it disinformation? Is the information just incomplete, or is a person trying to intentionally mislead us? You know, there are things like that to consider. So what can we do? Just like with everything else, the internet is both a positive and a negative. prompting the question, is the internet a net positive or a net negative in our lives? John Green, he's a popular vlogger online. You can watch his videos. He does really good, very interesting videos. But to ask that question, is the internet a net positive or a net negative, he suggests is a question wrongly put. And I really like the way that he reframes this thinking. And I think this is important. We need to reframe the question and approach it more, how can I make the internet a more positive force in my life and the lives of others? Okay, so when we're interacting with information online, having this motivation in the back of our mind, how can I use this tool, the internet, in the most positive way possible? And I think having that reframed question is important. Because ultimately, for it to be more positive, we should look for better information. Better information leads to better decision-making, which leads to a better world, okay? So this should be more of our driving force. So what can we do? As a librarian, it was difficult for me at first to reconcile telling people, no, that's bad information, because we don't like censorship. That's something that we are very opposed to in librarianship. But source evaluation is not the same as censorship. There is objectively good quality information, there's objectively bad quality information, okay? And it's important to kind of keep that in mind and kind of accept that certain things are just not going to be good information, okay? And being able to kind of make those assessments for ourselves. So what can we do as individuals? Reprogram our brains, our behaviors, to seek out information, to learn, to understand, to gain that better understanding of nuance and not just to validate. Tackle cognitive dissonance by reevaluating our views and beliefs in the context of new information, and to develop these habits of mind. This is something we actively have to think about and engage in. Otherwise, we're going to fall back into our comfortable habits. Developing healthy information consumption habits. Think critically about new information, right? This way that this is being presented to me, is this the only way that someone might think about it? What might someone else think? Seek and consume information from various sources, so you're not just having to try to imagine different perspectives. Go out and find those different perspectives, and actively explore different viewpoints. So you'll need to diversify your information consumption. Look for information from as many different sources as you can reasonably consume, all along the ideological spectrum. That way you can understand that issues are nuanced, because I think people forget that. They assume that things are black and white. They never are, right? Things are always more complicated. Exposure to different perspectives and language, so that you know that this particular way of thinking and this particular way of articulating a concept or an idea is not consistent across the board. Learn to recognize bias. Bias is not intentionally bad or not inherently bad, but recognizing and taking bias into consideration is important. And this will help you to gain a better understanding of an issue, being able to approach it from all these different angles and these perspectives. To help you with this, there are websites like procon.org, Opposing Viewpoints and Context. That's a library database. If you have access to a public library or academic institution, Opposing Viewpoints and Context is a very good database. Things like factcheck.org. You can rely on these kinds of websites to help you navigate. Like if a claim seems dubious, look it up on Procon or Fact Check or something like that and see if they address it and see what they have to say about it. Also, and I included this, I mentioned early on that there are source evaluation tools that we use in academia. PATS is one of them: purpose, authority, timeliness, and scope. That's appropriate for an academic context, right, when you're looking at information for writing a paper. But for a more casual context for a person, I pulled the core concepts of media literacy and the 5 questions that go along with that. The 5 core concepts of media literacy: all media messages are constructed. We have to know that everything's built with a purpose in mind. All media messages are constructed with creative language with its own rules. Very specifically chosen language with, again, for a purpose. Different people experience the same media messages differently. Media have embedded values and points of view. There's always going to be a purpose or perspective presented, and most media messages are organized to gain profit and or power. And so the questions that you ask yourself: who created this message? What creative techniques are used to attract my attention? How might different people understand this message differently from me? What values, lifestyles, and points of view are represented or omitted from this message? And why is this message being sent? These are questions to kind of ask yourself as you encounter new media, to kind of just be aware constantly, what is the purpose and what's being sold to me? Ultimately, we need to change people's motivations for seeking information, from reinforcing and validating to learning and understanding and reaching out and connecting with each other. So if we can, when we engage in information online, we should do so with the mindset of building bridges, not walls, building communities, not factions, seeking understanding and not validation, and then seeking learning and exploration and not just ignorance and isolation. Thank you.